Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and today we're going to be taking a look at another interview in the gaming space. Not Final Fantasy 16 this time, as much as I wish it was, as much as you probably wish it was. No, we're going to be taking a look at an interview that was conducted between 4Gamer, a Japanese media site, and Hidetaka Miyazaki. If you don't know the name, you definitely know the pedigree. He's the current president of FROMSoft and their star director, directing a few titles, such as Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, Elden Ring. You've probably heard of a few of those at least. There's just a few action RPGs out there in the world. Honestly, FromSoft has been something that I didn't even know I was obsessed with until I learned years down the line who they were. I first heard of them from Demon Souls, but I had been playing Armored Core games my entire childhood. I guess I just never looked at the developer. Even played some random GameCube game called Lost Kingdoms. It was all right, but that's obviously the last 10 years they produced some of my favorite RPGs of all time. So anytime something with Miyazaki comes out and it's talking about FromSoft, it's talking about their future, it's talking about updates, I usually give a look, even if I don't usually report on it on this channel. So today, we're going to be taking a look at that interview. Now, because 4Gamer is a Japanese site, translations are not my specialty. Google Translate is about as good as I get. Instead, we're going to be using an unofficial translation provided by HMMT over on the Elden Ring subreddit. It is in the description if you'd like to reference it, and he, of course, has a link to the original 4Gamer interview. If I recognize something that I read differently from Google Translate, maybe I'll bring it up, but otherwise I think we'll just stick to what it says right here. So Miyazaki first starts the interview by talking about Elden Ring, talking about its popularity and how it was kind of a surprise. It reached a whole new audience, way more than I think they expected. Maybe it was because of George R.R. Martin's involvement. Maybe it's because it's open world and the scope of the game was so big. They're not really sure. I can tell you that I think it's just because it's a $60 massive open world game that doesn't have a season pass, microtransactions, or any sort of already a planned or announced DLC before it even comes out. It generally has a pretty positive reception, and then it's just about whether or not people like the game after that. So then Miyazaki talks a little bit more about his development process. He talks about when they start planning a new game, they're always thinking about unique experiences. They actually go into quite a bit of depth in the Google Translate that I read of this, where they do talk about the risks of Sekiro, for example, here. They mention how Elden Ring in its scope was also a huge risk for the company, but that they really, really like to just think about every individual game as its own individual game. They don't just think about slapping a 2 on the end of something unless they feel like it actually deserves a 2. Even if they believe it would actually drive more sales, like if they made an Elden Ring 2, it's probably an instant seller. They probably don't even have to think that much about the quality, but they don't want to approach development that way. That's just not what they want. They just go, what do we want to make? And that really helps drive the team, which is a big theme of this interview, actually. And speaking to that, Elden Ring, the only reason it was a risk that worked out is because of their experience as a company up till now. Their past titles, especially the Souls series, just really helped them actually understand what they needed to do to make a game the scale of Elden Ring. They said there's no way they could have just made Elden Ring if it was their first game as a company. It just wouldn't have worked. Now, that being said, Elden Ring, massive success, but they can't let it be a standard that is permanently set. They can't be like, oh, this won't be as good as Elden Ring, or, we have to make sure the next game is better than Elden Ring. It's not like they need to hit a set review score or sale number. It's just not the most important thing. Those experiences and making sure that it's a game that the development team wants to make is key. They will make better games if it is something they really, really want to make. Now, moving forward a little bit, 4Gamer, the interviewer, referenced an interview that they conducted with Miyazaki back in 2018. Now, back then, Miyazaki had said there were about 3.5 teams, so basically 3 teams and then another team that was kind of forming that were working on different projects. Now, this unofficial translation says there were 2 unannounced. I've looked at the Google Translate and I've looked at a couple of other sources, and I believe it's 2 other than Elden Ring, because there were 3 and then there was a team being formed. So the big thing is, one of the titles back then in 2018 has released, Elden Ring. However, there are still other titles that are being worked on in From Software, and one in particular is actually in its final stages of development. Now, you got to remember that if it's a game that they have been working on for minimum 4 years as of this interview right now, there has to be something of relatively large scale, whether it be another Soulsborne type or them revisiting a franchise favorite. There have been rumors whirring that Armored Core would be making its return, despite one of the key creative forces around it actually leaving the company. And I believe they directed Daemon Ex Machina. I think they directed it. I'd have to go and double check that. But that person was responsible for a lot of the creativity that went into Armored Core. So I'm curious to see if it is Armored Core, if it's another project. Other parts in this interview really lead you to believe that there's no point in even predicting. You can hope, but there's no point in even really predicting that much, unless you really buy the rumors that are worrying about. So he just says one's in the final stages of development, and then everything else that's being worked on, he won't really talk about. Miyazaki spoke of the development system in place for FROMSoft and how they delineate teams, and there are other projects headed by other directors. He said he hopes to show a different side of flavor of FROMSoft. Again, that's me hoping Armored Core. They actually have a lot of other titles over the years. Obviously, I think Kingsfield, some people even think that there will be a modern version of Kingsfield, which is essentially the OG Souls experience back in the late 90s. If you've seen a video of it, you'll understand exactly what anyone means when they say that. But there are other things, and Miyazaki's own interests will kind of seep into a lot of that. And again, we'll touch on that a little bit later. So even though he's president, Miyazaki stated his intention to continue his role as director. I mean, he likes being a director. If the president of your company is involved in the development of the games in your company, that can be a good thing if it's done well. It can also be a bit scary, I'm sure, for some directors, but Miyazaki himself actually tackles that concern in this own interview. The interviewer actually talks a little bit about the environment in FROMSoft, how it's perceived as a harsh environment, which is, pretty intense. Miyazaki basically got into the industry. He didn't know anyone. He had no experience, but he managed to rise all the way through up to president of From Software. So despite this, the company has sort of an image that people think they're probably overworked or overexerted. And Miyazaki just says, no, that's definitely not the case. We've made a lot of improvements in recent years. They don't want anyone feeling physically exhausted. They don't want to put too much time restraint or expectations on people that could affect their work ethic. They've improved pay conditions, especially for younger and mid-career employees. And they are continuing to work on improving the situation, both from an actual work environment to a creative environment as well, which he touches on in the very next point. He spoke of a group-oriented development environment in FROMSoft, encourage or stimulus through cooperation. Essentially, don't think of just what you're doing. Think about how the entire team works as a cohesive unit. He himself, as humble as he is, says that he doesn't really think much of his own creative talents. He doesn't think he's some sort of genius. He accepts that his team kind of makes him strong. Everyone mutually inspires each other and encourages each other, and that really helps them get across the finish line when they have these really massive projects like the Soulsborns, like especially Elden Ring. He even mentions, the interviewer even mentions that you never really hear about anybody specifically from FROMSoft. When you look at other development companies, you might hear of a specific developer who's coined with this specific title. Us in the Final Fantasy XIV community, Yoshi P is always mentioned, Soken for his music. A lot of individual names are known, but with FROMSoft, it is pretty much Miyazaki people know, but everyone else is kind of one cohesive unit. From Software has developed this, not combat director, not art director, not this name, not that name. And it's a lot different than a lot of the industry. And the interviewer suggested it could be because of that cooperation. However, Miyazaki doesn't entirely agree with that assessment. Individuals do absolutely feel pride in their own work, but it's not about what you can achieve as an individual. It's about developing the whole game as a unit. Just don't fixate over specific points on little details. Just make sure the game is an overall good experience. And, even if you have your pride, don't let it get in the way of developing a game. Now, moving on to the next titles for FROMSoft, specifically Miyazaki's next title. He says he's already working on the next title that he will be directing. He won't talk much about it, but he actually states that over the years, while they've been developing the Dark Souls series and Elden Ring, they've been collecting these sort of abstract fantasy ideas, things that are almost kind of not meant for action RPG style games. And that seems to imply that maybe the next game he's directing is not an action RPG. It is not a Soulsborne. It is not an Elden Ring. It is not an Elden Ring DLC. And that's kind of supported by the way Miyazaki talks about what he wants for himself kind of in the future. Now, that's not to mean it won't be a great game, but I think a lot of people are kind of, again, fixated on FROMSoft being this, Soulsborne developer. And I don't think Miyazaki himself wants that to be their limiting factor. He actually released a VR exclusive title a few years ago. Now, I don't know the pronunciation, but I'm going to call it Daracene. Essentially, it was a VR style game where you have to... I haven't actually watched the gameplay, but I've read through the synopsis. There's a mystery going on, and there's all sorts of kind of paranormal elements to it. And it's a game that he says he personally put a lot of care and love into, but it didn't do very well. It doesn't help it was VR only. It was never ported away from VR. So, I mean, I'm sure that really didn't help. But he goes out of his way to talk about how that's actually something he's very interested in doing. He wants to be able to make these projects that are labors of love and not these giant AAA titles that FROMSoft is really, really known for. So they're working on making sure there are more directors in the company, that people are being trained and improved, and he wants to be able to leave projects that support the company to these other directors while he works on things that are more in his direct line of interest. The more staff that they hire, the better this will become. And they are actually in the process of hiring. In the original 4Gamer article, there is actually a link to their recruitment page, which they recently expanded upon quite a bit, I believe, just in the month of June. So he has his eyes on potentially just taking on more pet projects and leaving the bigger stuff to other people. Now, there are a couple of other things that he goes over here as well. He talks about these other directors being allowed to have proper creative control. He doesn't want to step on their toes, even though he is the president of the company and he technically oversees everything. He is also a director, and these are other directors, and he knows what that relationship can be like. So if he has overreach as a president, it could actually just negatively impact the whole thing, and it could all fall apart. He really doesn't want that. So he wants to be able to put the trust in these other directors that FROMSoft is rising up and making sure they're prepared for these bigger projects, and giving them the chance to really shine for themselves and not just kind of live in his shadow and live in his opinion and basically need to go by what he says. He doesn't want that. Now, one last little tidbit. Miyazaki says that updates for Elden Ring will continue. I know that sounds exciting. It doesn't mean anything, because updates could be like 1.05, which has all these bug fixes and things, or it could be buffs, or it could be nerfs, or it could be fixes, or it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a DLC. And I feel like if it was something more serious, like an expansion or a DLC, it would probably not be so generically listed as update. But we'll continue to hope. There's a lot of fan theories out there about things with the lands between that could really lead to some interesting places to travel to and see. There's also civilizations we hear about but know very, very little about. So I hope it gets a DLC. That's the nice thing about FROMSoft games. You get a game, you buy a full game, you feel like you paid for a full game, like you were rewarded with your purchase, and then you're like, man, I sure hope they release some DLC. You don't get very many companies that are like, please give me DLC for this game instead of, anything else. That's an earned perspective as far as I'm concerned. So in addition to titles he is directing, there are other projects from within FROMSoft that are being directed by other people. We already knew this. They had just mentioned earlier that there were other projects that were being directed in team. So, and then there was one more thing, and yeah, I did forget to include this as well. Said the ideal company in his eyes is one made up of people focused on making fun games. That's the kind of place he wants FROMSoft to be. You know what? As a consumer, we want you to want that, because then we get to play fun games, and we get to thank you for the fun game. You get to make money. We get to feel entertained. Everybody wins. It's a nice, simple relationship there. Anyway, let me know what you thought about what Miyazaki had to say about the various development processes. What title do you think they're going to be releasing next? What do you think that game is in its final stages of development? Is it a VR game? Maybe, they did like a Monster Hunter Diary game back on like the 3DS in 2015. Maybe it's that again. Who knows? I don't know. We don't know. Let me know what you think it is. I'm going to put Armored Core 6 in my bin. That's what I'm hoping for. Anyway, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care.